Surely you've heard the story of Theseus and the Minotaur. It has been repeated in art hundreds of thousands of times, so I just can't imagine you haven't heard of it. But what I bet you've never heard, at least until this video, is that Minotaur was real. Theseus was perhaps the greatest hero of Greek mythology, the divine king of Athens, and in his time, the island of Crete would have been ruled by a wicked and powerful king named Minos. Minos was the son of Zeus and a Phoenician princess named Europa, and taking the form of a white bull, Zeus had abducted her, carried her to Crete, and impregnated her, as Zeus does. There, she would become that island's queen. When it came his own time to rule, Minos would ask Poseidon, then still the god of husbandry and not the god of the sea, for a white bull of his own to sacrifice. But upon the moment of killing it, he spared its life. And angered at this disrespect, this husband Poseidon would punish him with a monster for a son. Sending Minos' wife into a fit of insanity, she asked the Greek engineer Daedalus to build her a cow outfit so she could seduce that white bull. The son that she would bear from it would become known as the Minotaur, real name Asterion. In embarrassment, Minos would ask that same engineer to build him a labyrinth to hide this newborn shame, and in that maze, Asterion would go insane, Minos sending him doomed men and women to die by his double-headed axe. But these wouldn't just be any old sacrifices. They'd be Athenians. Prisoners that Minos had demanded in exchange for the death of his own son Androgenes, an athlete who'd been killed while visiting mainland Greece. In some myths, he was even killed by the bull of Marathon, a bull that itself, according to those legends, had originally come from Crete. Either way, after his death, every 9 years, those Athenians would be forced to send 7 men and 7 women to come be sacrificed to Minos' Minotaur. That is, until a great Greek hero came and killed him. The son of the king of Athens, Theseus volunteered himself to be among those sent, not to die, but rather to kill. As a test of his strength, he was first sent to slay the Marathon bull, but having proven himself on the mainland, he would then go to Crete and end those sacrifices for good. There on Crete, Theseus would slay that monster and seduce the daughter of Minos. She would in turn help him escape that labyrinth, ride with him halfway back to Athens, and then he would ditch her and she would die. The engineer Daedalus, his maze now meaningless, attempted to fly to Sicily with his son Icarus, but Icarus didn't listen, flew too high, melted his wings, and died. Obviously, none of these things really happened. And yet, in a way, I'd argue they kind of did. Because when you learn the history of Crete, every single section of this story seems to, at the very least, potentially represent these real historical moments that are being remembered by the Athenians a full 1,000 years after they happened. In 3000 BC, 2,500 years before these stories would become popular, Crete was ruled by a civilization we now call the Minoans, named obviously after that mythical king Minos. But as far as we can tell, the word Minos didn't actually refer to a single person. It was more like a title, perhaps the same as saying ruler or general today. Although historians also tend to believe that the Minoans weren't actually even ruled by men. Not in the sense that we'd commonly frame that today, anyway. They likely wouldn't have had kings, but were presumably ruled instead as a theocracy, and the heads of their system would have been priestesses. And so just as that original queen Europa would have supposedly given birth to Minos, so too did the system of priestesses likely give birth to Minoa. Europa the Phoenician, they'd call her. Which also makes sense when you break it down, because even though Minoa predated Phoenicia by hundreds, if not a full 1,000 years, to the Greeks of 500 BC retelling this story, the Phoenicians would have been the greatest ancient uninterrupted power in the Mediterranean. Unlike virtually everyone else, they hadn't fully collapsed when the Bronze Age fell, and so their cultural heritage would have shared what was likely the closest and least changed reference points to ancient Sumer, Egypt, Anatolia, the Levant, and Crete. Basically any of the other cultures that the Athenians would encounter. So in a respect, when the Greeks say that Europa was a Phoenician, what they might well be saying is that her existence speaks to an older history, that she references a deeper culture. What they might well be saying is that the system that governed Minoa was rooted in a more ancient past. It connected to what they saw in the Phoenicians, which is entirely true, whether they realized that or not. And we can guess this somewhat from the name of the Minotaur, Asterion. It's the same name as his grandfather, that Cretan king who'd married Europa, but it's also so much more than that, because it's the concept of the sacred bull. Why a minotaur? Why that animal specifically? Well, in Minoan society, the most important religious symbol would have been that of the bull. Its horns were seen as portents of great power, and it adorned all their important buildings. Their sacred chambers would have contained almost nothing but symbols of this animal, specifically its horns. Festivals would have centered around a sport known as bull leaping, and the masculine power of their system would have relied on the connection that their ruling consorts would have had with those bulls. And that's certainly not unique to Crete. That's ancient. If you go back to the dawn of history itself, bulls would have almost certainly been considered an omen of great power. They're one of humanity's founding gods. In Sumer, believed to be Earth's first civilization, they built statues of a half-human, half-bull goddess named Lamassu, kind of a reverse minotaur. She was a protective spirit, defender of the royal household, and was often placed above the entrance of a city or a home. And from those Sumerians, the concept of that sacred bull would spread into seemingly every civilization that would ever grace this region. In Egypt, the direct precursor to both Minoa and Phoenicia, bulls would be called Ka, a religious word meaning life force or power. In Persia, to the Zoroastrians, the bull Gavevodata would be considered the source of all beneficial animal life. In India, the bull carried Shiva. In Manipur, it was cow. To the Gauls, they called it Tauros. And in the lands of Canaan, it would be represented as the gods Baal and El, as well as the golden calf worshipped by the pagan Israelites. Bulls held up the symbolic earth in the Temple of Solomon. The god Moloch watched over Carthage. It was such a powerful symbol that it would eventually become short form for the very idea of paganism. The monotheists of Judea would even incorporate this concept into their anti-pagan symbolism, giving their devil horns as a means of associating evil and wrongdoing with the worship of the great bull. These are just a few examples, but there are dozens, if not hundreds, left unsaid. Put simply, the bull is one of our most important and everlasting symbols of a masculine god. But few would display it quite as prominently as those Minoans. Which gives us half of that minotaur. But the other half, as I've already mentioned, likely is best understood through his name. Because by the time the cult of the sacred bull had reached here on the island of Crete, it had likely already merged with what was one of the most important religious figures to ever dominate our world. Her name was Astarte, from which we likely get the Minotaur's name, Asterion. She was originally a Sumerian mother goddess known as Ishtar, but having spread across the Near East for thousands of years, just like that bull, she'd taken on many new forms, and with each civilization she encountered, her symbol would change alongside. It was less a direct translation and more of a constant churning and readapting of an old idea. In Egypt, she would become Hathor, mother to the sun god Ra. To the Hindus, she would be Parvati. To the Elamites, Pinikir. In Yemen, as well as Ethiopia's Aksum, she would become the male god Atar. And yet she was the mother goddess, from which all others sprung. And in the areas that would eventually become Phoenicia, she would be the consort to Baal, the storm god, the bull. In some instances, these two deities would merge into what was effectively one being. She would be the mask that Baal wore on his face, just as Hathor would sometimes merge with Ra to become his great eye. And spreading out from Minoa to their outposts on the mainland, this pairing would become reflected in the gods of those rising Athenians. Baal would become the Greek Zeus, who legend says was born on Crete. Himself a storm god like his predecessor, he would often transmute himself into the body of a bull. His father Kronos is also referred to as the bull, but then so was Hera, his wife. In fact, ancient Greeks would have often referred to her as the cow, and not in the rude sense you might imagine today, but as a means of genuine respect. Poseidon, then the original god of husbandry before that of the sea, was also symbolized as a bull, as was at times Dionysus. Astarte, that great mother of the world, would become Aphrodite, but also Europa, the queen of Crete, and yet somehow also Hera, the cow, as well as Hera's assistant Io, also a cow. Which might sound a bit confusing, but try to imagine these as more like frames from which all the gods and goddesses can be created, symbolic pieces to move around on a constantly changing board. They represent everything. Astarte was both mother and daughter, the bull both father and son. Pagan though they might have been, in effect, they represented the very concept of gods. And so when those Greeks said that Zeus and Europa had a child together and that the child was Asterion the Minotaur, it's not all that complicated to understand what they might have been talking about. These were all just forms of Astarte, of Ishtar, of Lamassu, none of them exactly her, but all containing elements of her. Like a great game of religious telephone thousands of years down the line. That Minotaur was a representation of both the huntress and the sacred bull that she hunted. It was both the founding goddess of Sumer just as much as it was those statues that protected her cities. The Minotaur was simply yet another representation of those ancient gods. At least as far as we know. Obviously, none of us can really go back and ask. But we can fairly safely guess that given the theocratic structure of Minoan society and the influence that it had on the foundation of what would become Athens, these figures of mythology didn't just represent Crete's gods, but their system as a whole. When the Greeks say Minos, they effectively mean Minoan society. When they say the Minotaur, they effectively mean Minoan religion and therefore culture. The story of Theseus is almost certainly the story of Minoan Crete being conquered by the Mycenaean Athenian Greeks. Even the slaying of the bull of Marathon is likely just a memory of kicking out those Minoan outposts off the mainland before their eventual invasion of Crete. And now that we understand what that Minotaur is, let's look at his maze. Because every word here has a meaning. Labyrinth, for example, translates to double-sided axe, the most important symbol of religious power among that Minoan elite. It was a weapon not used for war, but religious rites, a weapon that itself mimicked the horns of that bull that they so revered. And it would have lined their temple walls, filling the most important rooms like a frame. And their main temple, Knossos, would have certainly felt like a maze. It was even presented that way in the symbolism of their time. Because it was this massive structure, in its era, unrivaled in both size and scale virtually anywhere else on this planet. It would have had multiple stories with dark passageways, this unbelievable number of rooms and hallways that all wrap back into each other. For a visiting dignitary, for an early Athenian who'd never seen anything even remotely as impressive as this, it would have felt truly labyrinthian. To escape it would essentially require the knowledge of a local, symbolically the daughter of Minos. But around 1400 BC, Knossos and the great Minoan civilization would be conquered and ruled by mainland Greeks, the ancestors of the people who would eventually tell this story. So what was Theseus, this hero of Athens, if not a representation of those soldiers? That invasion that would destroy Crete's culture and that sacred bull and return it all as Zeus and his pantheon? What is this myth, if not that memory? And now that I'm deep in this symbolism, it's hard to not look even further, because perhaps even Daedalus himself represents something from that time. Those skilled Greeks who'd been enticed to the court of the Minoans, hired to work and fight against their Athenian brethren. Perhaps his inability to escape after the death of that Minotaur is symbolic of those mercenaries being destroyed alongside their adopted world. Perhaps that's why Icarus fell, because their sons would have been tainted, never allowed back to the world their fathers left. Or perhaps it's just a story relying on a narrative figure everybody already knew. It's not like we can go back and ask. It would have been 1,000 years after the conquest of Crete before Athenians even began to popularize this story. Which makes me wonder, did they even understand it themselves? Did they, telling it to each other, know that it represented this conquest of a civilization long dead? And yet, no matter how they framed it, Theseus did slay that Minotaur. That was real. He killed a god as old as civilization itself, and in its place, he raised it back up, renamed it, and made it his own. That's the death that gave us Athens. So rest in peace, Asterion. I think you've earned your sleep, because you protected this house for 2,000 years. And although that monster Theseus came and killed you, I suspect that it's you who we will always remember. Because no matter what names we give it, as long as there are people on this earth, Ishtar will never die. This is Rare Earth.